Thank you for joining us today at Frier Levitt's Mastering GLP-1 Compounding Series Question and Answer Roundup. Throughout our insightful three-part webinar series this summer, we received a number of excellent questions, and we wanted to take this opportunity to address them live in this follow-up session. My name is Dr. Martha Rumore. I'm Senior Counselor at Frier Levitt. I'm a pharmacist attorney with 20 years of experience representing pharmacy clients in the areas of food, drug, and cosmetic law, regulatory compliance, and intellectual property. I head up the IP group at Frier Levitt, and I'm admitted before the United States Patent and Trademark Office. I also want to mention that I have lots of experience as a compounding pharmacist for a New York City hospital. I'm pleased to be joined today by my colleagues Arielle Miliambro and Dae Lee. Together, we'll dive into the most pressing questions from our recent GLP-1 Compounding Series. Arielle, would you please introduce yourself?
Good afternoon. I'm Arielle Miliambro, and I'm a partner in our firm's regulatory practice. I've been with Frier Levitt for the past 10 years, and I divide my time between our life sciences and healthcare departments with respect to the regulatory work that I do, including matters related to fraud, waste, and abuse, telehealth and digital technology, privacy and security, and professional board rules, both on the physician and pharmacy side, including related to fee splitting issues, scope of practice, and prescribing and dispensing requirements.
Thanks, Arielle. Dae, would you please introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Thanks, Martha. My name is Dae Lee. I'm one of the partners and pharmacist attorney at Frier Levitt. I represent pharmacies and independent providers with respect to different pharmacy-related issues, including without limitation compounding issues, but also payer issues such as PBM audits and disputes. We also have other attorneys who handle other aspects of the pharmacy industry and related issues, such as Arielle said, as Arielle indicated, that we have regulatory department. We also have a transactional department who can help the pharmacies during any acquisition.
Thank you, Dae. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items. This program is being recorded, and we'll send you a link on the on-demand version following the session. Please note the content of the program is for informational purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice, and we encourage you to consult legal counsel for specific guidance related to your unique circumstances. During the 1-hour presentation, we're going to be addressing the questions that we've received throughout the series, the three-part series. While we won't be taking live questions today, please feel free to submit any additional questions via the Q&A tab on your screen. These submissions are private and visible only to the presenters, and we'll be happy to follow up with you after the session. Our contact information is displayed on the screen, so please don't hesitate to reach out to us directly for further discussion. With that, we're going to get started. We're going to have an update on what has happened since our last webinar of the three-part series. So what's on everybody's mind? The first thing that happened was on Monday, Novo Nordisk filed another round of lawsuits aimed at weight loss clinics and wellness spas. And one of the lawsuits was filed against a New Jersey telemedicine weight loss company. The allegations are for passing off compounded semaglutide as the brand products Wegovy and Ozempic. The claims were for allegedly false and misleading advertising, and they're being brought under the Lanham Act, which is 15 U.S.C. sections 1052. And so that's for trademark infringement. The issue that the issue that is being brought is that the patients will be confused into mistakenly believing that they're purchasing brand semaglutide that has undergone FDA approval. There are also some claims for violations of the New Jersey Fair Trade Act. The compounds themselves from these weight loss clinics, they come from 503A, 503B sources per the website for the company. And so the issue, as we said, is that, this is may possibly causing confusion where there's evidence on the, their websites maybe that there might be trademark infringement when they're making claims such as the compounds are generic to the brand product or similar to or substitutable for. So we strongly recommend that your advertising be vetted through IP, FDA attorneys, especially if you have a website. And although some of the defendants in this most recent round are pharmacies, are not for none of the defendants, I should say, are pharmacies. The pharmacies that supply the compounds will, most likely receive third-party subpoenas for information. So that's, something to keep in mind. And also, it's very interesting that none of the lawsuits have been for patent infringement, but one of our questions relates to that, so we'll talk about that later. So the other question that's on everybody's mind is tirzepatide coming off of the 506 E-list. And a few weeks back, many letters went out to pharmacies and physician practices from Eli Lilly's legal counsel that tirzepatide was no longer on shortage, that it was commercially available, and that it could no longer be compounded. And we received many queries from pharmacy compounders. Some of them went to the FDA website, and to their astonishment, tirzepatide was still on the FDA shortage list. Some physician practices reported that if it was on shortage, the pharmacy still didn't have the brand product available. There was this communication that was somewhat effective from the brand company because there was probably a whole slew of pharmacies that did indeed cease and desist from compounding upon receiving such a stern letter. When I checked today, both the semaglutide and the tirzepatide are still on the FDA 506E shortage list, meaning that even essentially a copy is able to be compounded. There is a prohibition on compounding if they come off of the shortage list, but if they're on the shortage list, they're essentially not commercially available. And it is true that the manufacturers are spending tons of money to ramp up production with new facilities, but it's also true that in order for drugs to come off of the shortage list, FDA has to be shown with like calculations, data, et cetera, that the supply does meet the demand. And right now, some of that demand is being met with compounded products. So the manufacturers have to also account for that. In addition, in March of 2024, the FDA approved a new indication for semaglutide, Wegovy, to reduce heart attack, stroke, and cardiovascular death in adult patients who are overweight and obese and have cardiovascular disease. And the companies are also seeking other indications. There's some early data that shows evidence for a beneficial effect in mental health illnesses, including depression and bipolar disorder. But to make a long story short is that as the indications expand, the market demand and the duration of shortages is going to increase. There's an inverse relationship there. The last thing FDA wants to do is take the drugs off the shortage list only to place them back on, because that can cause disruptions of patient care, can cause confusion, not to mention that there's going to be criticism of FDA if that's done. The next thing that I want to talk about just briefly as an update is some of the FDA dosing error and other compounding warnings in 2024. And I'm going to tell you why those FDA warnings are important at this point. In July of 2026, July 26 of 2024, the FDA issued an alert regarding reports of adverse events that it has received, and with some of the patients requiring hospitalization, that it may be related to overdoses due to the dosing errors. And it seems that the errors have resulted from patients measuring and self-administering incorrect doses and healthcare providers miscalculating the doses of the drug. So the patients in these cases, most of them received vials, and they lacked experience with self-injections, and that's according to these adverse drug event reports. The FDA is encouraging pharmacists to provide patients with the appropriate syringe and to counsel the patients on how to measure the intended dose using the syringe. Then in August 22nd of this year, FDA issued an alert to healthcare professionals regarding reports of serious patient illnesses and death linked to poorly compounded drugs in general. So that warning is not specific to the GLP-1s. However, there's another warning. So in 2024 alone, FDA has issued 3 safety alerts for compounded drugs. They only had 1 safety alert in 2023. And, based on this, FDA may feel the need to act based on these safety reports, and they do seem poised to do so. If you recall, there was an MOU that was developed in consultation with the NABP for states to sign up for, and some of the provisions in that would have been for ADR reporting by 503A compounders. Some states actually do require 503A certain ADRs to be reported. States like California, they have to report certain adverse events to the MedWatch program, but generally that's not required. That MOU would the state sign on to that's one of the provisions. And so FDA was sued with regard to that MOU. It was suspended. If you look on the FDA website, you're still going to see that it's suspended. But, keep in mind that it's not only ADRs. There were provisions in there addressing interstate distribution of inordinate amounts of compounded drugs. And FDA stated that they do intend to revisit this MOU and go through the appropriate framework to have it revisited. So it seems to me, at least, and some of my colleagues in the industry, that FDA may be getting poised to revisit that MOU since they're stressing these safety issues, for compounded drugs. The next thing I'll just briefly talk about is in our last webinar, we spoke about the 503B to 503A sales, and that was pursuant to a June 27, 2023 FDA draft guideline that permitted 503A pharmacies to purchase compounded medications from 503B facilities. There, a bunch of limitations to that. The accepting 503A can't wholesale the compounded drugs that it receives from the 503B. The outsourced medication has to be dispensed under a patient-specific prescription. And it all has to be consistent with local board of pharmacy regulations. And there's the rub, because certain states are pushing back, stating that it's only a draft. It's not a final guidance. One of the states is Arkansas. And they're saying that it's not permitted. And they're, making statements to that effect. Other states have actually enacted laws that are permitting the practices of 503B to 503A. And we have other states that have taken absolutely no position. So the last thing I just want to briefly talk about is the FDA's proposed rule regarding drugs that are difficult to compound, and whether or not that affects the GLP compounding. And the short answer is that difficult to compound list, it does not affect specifically the GLPs. The difficult to compound proposed rule came out March 20th, 2024, and basically it pertains to compounding of drugs that they refer to as having demonstrable difficulties for compounding. And they identify 3 types of compounds. The first is oral solid modified release drug products that employ coded systems. The second is liposomal drug products. And the third are drug products that are compounded using hot melt extraction. It's very interesting because none of these 3 methods are, currently being used for compounding. Currently, these technologies are not being used, but in the future they may. And this is there's a lot of comments from pharmacy groups saying that this is really a restriction on pharmaceutical innovation in the compounding sector. There's also the same thing about the notice and comment period, that the time frame is insufficient. They're adding categories versus specific drugs, and the FDA doesn't seem to have the statutory authority to add categories to the list because Section 503A pertains to drug products, not whole categories. So there's pushback on this as well. We'll see what happens in the future for that.
Yeah, thanks, Martha. All right, so if you have any additional questions that you want to ask us, please feel free to us or one of us. As you will notice, there's a direct number, office lines, as well as our email addresses. So please do not hesitate to contact us if you have any specific questions about the GLP-1 and the industry development in that whole compounding space. So with that said, as many of you attended our previous three-part series webinar, we during and following that webinar we received many questions. So we'd like to have a chance to answer those questions to the extent we can today. So the first couple ones for me. So question number one, is there a FDA database to check 503B authorized semaglutide outsourcing facilities? Well, there is if you go to FDA's website, there is a list of 503B outsourcing facilities, but it does not specify whether it is for the authorized semaglutide outsourcing facility only. So what you should do is if you're 503A pharmacy purchasing from 503B pharmacy, it's always a good idea to check whether that facility is listed in that FDA website. Okay. And the next question is, can compounded 503B drugs be shipped to the patient? Well, the answer is no. 503B pharmacies can only sell their medication to healthcare facilities for office use only, except that the FDA issued in a report allowing 503B facilities to sell to 503A pharmacy who can then dispense to patients per patient-specific prescription. However, as Martha indicated before, certain states do not allow this practice, so you should be mindful of not only the federal regulation and the federal law, but also the state law to see if there's any restriction on dispensing products purchased from 503B facilities. Okay. All right, the second question. What's the checklist for due diligence that pharmacies can utilize when evaluating whether a manufacturer is has the right credentials, or the 503B has the right credential, or even the API that is being purchased are the legit products? Well, I think you have to look at the totality of the circumstances and really consult with the industry experts, one of us and our attorneys from our firm, and to really develop a checklist that fits your business model and fits your practice. I mean, there is no cookie cutter that applies to, globally to all the pharmacies out there. And that's why you need to really consult with a healthcare attorney, and then come up with the checklist, and then utilize a checklist to the vetting of the source, vetting of the manufacturers or 503B, the API manufacturers as well, and then also check the state law and see if there's any restriction on compounding or dispensing the semaglutide, and making sure that you as a 503A pharmacy or as a 503 supplier have the right credentials in order to continue your operation or even start your operation. Okay. All right, the next question is for Martha. So Idaho seems to have an outdated rule that 503B pharmacies can supply, but then the product cannot be redispensed, only used in office or dispensed from 503B. Has the state reconciled this yet, or are the Idaho-based pharmacies still stuck with this regulation?
So I think this question pertains to an outdated rule that Idaho has, and that rule is defining what's transpiring with the 503B to 503A, as then the 503A is redispensing it. And so that's, still the way it is in Idaho. But if you look at the FDA draft guidance, it indicates that outsourcing facilities can sell to hospitals, they can sell to physicians' offices, pharmacies, and other authorized recipients who may administer or dispense the product. So the FDA guidance is very clear. It reasoned that the sale or transfer that takes place as part of dispensing or administering is an exception to the prohibition on wholesaling. But like I say, that some states, they prohibit redispensing, which oddly goes against that draft FDA guidance. The state of Nevada, I'll give you an example, they actually took the opposite position. They enacted SB 161, which explicitly allows pharmacies to purchase from 503B outsourcing facilities. So the reason why they passed that law was because they previously had a law in the books that explicitly prohibited it. So they wanted to, clarify that. When and if that FDA guidance becomes finalized, and I say if because there's a lot of times that the draft guidances never get finalized, or it could take years even, depending on, and there's been, there's a lot of comments on this particular one. But when that finally gets finalized, it will most likely better define what is and is not an impermissible transfer of compounded drugs, and things like how to label them, because when it comes from the 503B, it's going to say right on their label, not for resale and stuff like that. And so there's certain things that are going to need to be ironed out.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, Martha. The next question is for Arielle. If a physician has a dispensing license, does that allow them to use 503B produced products for administration or dispensing out of the office?
So generally, a 503B outsourcing facility, like you mentioned, Dae, and Martha, you touched on as well, it can compound and sell in bulk rather than a patient-specific prescription, which is what would be compounded by a 503A compounding pharmacy. And so those 503B facilities can sell those products typically directly to a provider's office for office use. And if a practice is purchasing from a 503B, they need to keep in mind what their model calls for, and whether they intend to administer the product or whether they intend to dispense the product. If they're going to be dispensing, they'll need to understand state-specific rules regarding dispensing practitioners, whether there's limitations on in-office dispensing or IOD, and whether there's associated registration requirements for IOD. So, for example, there's a number of states that will allow a practitioner to engage in IOD, but they are significantly limited by the days supply that they're allowed to dispense. If the provider's administering the product and seeing the patient for each administration of the product, that's a different mechanism of conveyance than the dispensing would be. And so really, ultimately, each model requires review of applicable state law as to how, when, and what a provider can dispense to patients as compared to what they can administer directly.
Thank you. All right. The next couple questions are for Martha. All right, so let me start with the first one. Can 503B sell to other pharmacies but not for resale? What is the difference?
So pharmacies can dispense, and that's not considered resale. But pharmacies can sell to 503As, and that includes prescribers, because prescribers, are considered like 503As. It doesn't matter that the compound originally comes from a 503B. And then, like a 503B typically could sell to a prescriber for office use. That doesn't matter in this instance if it's going through the 503A.
All righty. Then what about, so will 503As be able to compound the sublingual form once it's off the shortage list?
So there's a lot of interest in this, once it's off the shortage list. And then some compounding pharmacies are making the GLP-1 agonist into sublingual, and that doesn't exist currently, that route commercially. It's not commercially available. That, because it's a different route, it should not be, it's not considered essentially a copy of the FDA approved drug. In fact, when you think about what compounding is, the art and practice of compounding, that's at the core, creating an alternative dosage form or strength of a drug when in the judgment of the prescriber, it produces a clinical difference for the patient. Now, keep in mind, this is not legal advice because every situation is different. It depends on what you're compounding. It depends on the patient. It depends on what the prescriber is. There's a lot of different things that go into it. So this is not legal advice for a specific situation. But the commercially available drug is not indicated for and can't be used via the sublingual route. The strength of the sublingual formulation, that's expressed as milligram per ml. It's not the same, similar, or easily substitutable for the commercially available dosage strength. The dose for sublingual is typically going to be a smaller dose because because of different pharmacokinetic factors. The doses written for prescribers, they're probably not within that plus or minus 10% of the dosages offered by the commercially available product. So at least for those reasons alone, it's not essentially a copy, and the essentially a copy 503A FDA guidance would not result in deeming a sublingual formulation as a copy of a commercially available product.
Okay, thank you. But what would constitute like medical necessity for continuing to compound the injectable forms?
So if we look at the FDA guidance on essentially a copy, there's an Appendix A of that guidance. And it says that if the compounded product is not essentially a copy, and again, it's got all these criteria like different dosage, would be, if it's different dosage, plus or minus, more than plus or minus 10%. If it's a different, it could be, it could be the same API, but it's a different dosage. If it's a different, strength, all this kind of things, then that would be not essentially a copy of a commercially available drug. And so if it's not essentially a copy, then it can be compounded just like any other compound under Section 503A of the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act. Compounding a product that's not essentially a copy doesn't trigger the medical necessity analysis. If you look at that Appendix A on that FDA guidance, if the compounded product is essentially a copy because it's got the same API, it's got the same dosage strength and the same route. And when I say same route, keep in mind that if it's labeled for, subcutaneous, but it can be given IM, the guidance clearly says that even though the FDA package insert says subcutaneous, if it can be given IM, that's still the same route. So, but if it's essentially a copy, then it has to go through the medical necessity analysis. And I think the next question I have, Dae, says, what are the guidelines for documenting medical necessity? Yes. So I'll just go right into that because, compounds by their very nature, they're custom-made products for specific patients. The medical necessity documentation requirements, like I said, it only kicks in if the compounded drug is essentially a copy, but it's not on the shortage list. So there's two things there. It can't be essentially a copy, and it's not on the shortage list. Because if it's on the shortage list, then you can compound essentially a copy. And so then you need to ask the questions that go to medical necessity. And there's one question. Was a change made for an identified individual patient that produces a significant difference for that patient? That's what medical necessity is. And the prescriber documents the significant difference, and that has to be documented on the prescription, and then that can be, compounded. The reason can't be a pretext. It can't be like where the physicians are receiving incentives to write compounded prescriptions, and nor can the significant difference for that patient be based on lower price. So it's like the brand product costs whatever, and the compound costs that. So that's why we're compound. That can't be the reason either. There's no particular format for the documentation requirement, but if the reason for the medical necessity, that difference, whatever that difference for that particular patient is omitted, or if it's unclear, the pharmacist must contact the prescriber and make a notation on the prescription, which includes the date of the conversation. And then that has to be, there's a record retention period. I guess, it depends on the states. Some states want pharmacy records to be kept for 5 years, some states for, 3 years, whatever. So you have to, keep your individual state requirements in mind. But FDA has said that it's not going to question what the prescriber's determination of a significant difference for that prescriber's patient is.
Thank you. All right, the next question. Although pharmacies can't transfer compounds between them, how can they leverage central fill rules in states that allow for central fill relationships? For example, can a pharmacy licensed in state A but not in state B engage a pharmacy who is licensed in state B to produce a compound for a patient in state B and participate in the shared services on that dispensing? Does it matter if they are commonly owned? Arielle, can you help answer this question?
So pharmacies may be able to leverage central fill or shared service arrangements in GLP-1 models to the same extent they'd be able to leverage them in any other arrangement. And the critical factor is whether the parties are complying with central fill and shared service rules. Some states don't permit any type of shared service. Others will permit very limited shared services in the absence of common ownership. But in states where shared services are allowed, whether as central fill or as central processing, pharmacies can enter into those relationships with one another as long as they're adhering to that state's rules. And one of the most fundamental requirements in nearly every state's central fill framework is that both pharmacies need to be licensed by the state applicable to the prescription that they're sharing. So if one of those pharmacies isn't licensed in the state of consequence, like you described, Dae, there is a high likelihood of discipline. As to whether common ownership changes things, it generally won't in terms of licensing. Both pharmacies still typically need to be licensed. But some states where shared services are restricted, boards of pharmacy may be more amenable to division of duties when the pharmacies are commonly owned.
Got it. Okay, so when promoting compounding, a pharmacy can a pharmacy not list that they compound a GLP-1 as long as it isn't listed as a generic for the commercial product or for off-label use? What about supplying patient information about the compounded GLP-1 on the website for the educational purposes? Let me take this question. So we need to evaluate obviously the marketing materials on a case-by-case basis. And as Martha indicated from earlier today, Novolog and other manufacturer Lilly have pursued lawsuit against weight loss clinics and even pharmacies or dispensing providers for trademark infringement or copyright infringement, intellectual property infringement. And I think it's really important for pharmacies, and they need to be really careful, not only given the ramification of the potential legal losses by the manufacturers, but also potential consequences or disciplinary action that can be initiated by the Board of Pharmacies, that we need to be really careful about what we put out there. So I think this is another area of concern for pharmacies, and the pharmacies should engage experts to have us review your documents, have us review your marketing materials, promotional material, pamphlets, your websites, and to make sure there are no health claims being promoted, for example. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that you have to avoid claims for compounded products using any manufacturer's trade name or wording such as same ingredient or similar to. It just creates exposure on the pharmacy. So there's no like uh, uh, you know um, cookie cutter answer for this. It depends on the marketing materials and promotion materials that the pharmacy is planning to use or has been using, and we need to really dive into it and then analyze the illegal ramification. And if we need to rectify it, then we'll provide the answers then.
And I would just add to what Dae said that, it doesn't matter if you're a small compounder or a large compounder, because, the internet, I mean, years ago, you're a small compounder, you're not advertising, maybe you'd be under the radar. But with the internet now, everything's out in the open. And so the brand manufacturers, they're looking for the internet, seeing if who's compounding their products, and then they're reviewing the ads. They're going through, they're doing a word search on their brand name and seeing if it comes up on somebody else's site. And then even things like you don't realize it. You think it's your patients are so happy because they've lost so much weight, and then you advertise that on your website with a testimonial. And Arielle could even, we could speak to that. We've had those cases where people don't realize that the testimonials, you can't just throw a testimonial up that says this drug is effective and you'll lose so much weight in so many months and things like that. So you've got to be very, very careful. And then I just wanted to go back to one of the questions that I had about the essentially a copy, if I could, just a second. There was a question, I think, that was part of the question was, what if you add other ingredients? Does that change it from being essentially a copy? And if it's two products that are essentially a copy and you're just putting them together, like you're adding B12 or you're adding something else, pyridoxine, to the GLP, but there's still a commercially available, B12 or commercially available pyridoxine, and you're not doing something unique, then it's still essentially a copy, and you're still going to have to go to if it's off the shortage list, you're still going to have to go to the next facet of that, which is the significant change for an identified patient. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. All right, the next question. Have you seen or heard of an issue regarding a formulation patent that Eli Lilly holds? I know that some compounding pharmacy add medication or vitamins to tirzepatide, like vitamin B. However, if Eli Lilly holds patents on specific formulations for tirzepatide, including potential combination, then it could prevent compounding pharmacies from legally adding these to tirzepatide. Have you heard or seen this come up in your practice? Arielle, can you help answer this question?
I think this is Martha's
Martha
question.
Yeah, I mean, we've all been faced with this in our practices, but the drugs most of the drugs that are compounded, they're not protected by patents. Most of the drugs are, typically they've been generic products, right, that are compounded and they're off patent. Generics are off patent. The GLP-1s, they are protected by patents, but there's no section, of the Food Drug Cosmetic Act or Hatch-Waxman or any other FDA statute which discusses whether or how compounders are liable for patent infringement. Similarly, there's nothing in the Patent Act that creates exceptions for drug compounding. There have been very few cases, however, where the drug manufacturers have sued compounding pharmacists, but those cases have mostly settled. They've resulted in a default judgment, that's not to say that the stakes are not higher now and there wouldn't be a lawsuit. However, a claim for a patent infringement while a drug is on shortage and not commercially available is, very unlikely to prevail. And that's because it's really the brand company's failure to meet the demand for the drug that will impact the damages award. And that's damages award in the patent litigation is going to be based on lost profits. So it's difficult, if not impossible, to prove these kinds of damages if the brand company was unable to supply the drug in the first place. A second reason why you haven't seen claims of patent infringement against compounders is that the FDA guidance on compounding drugs on the shortage list, it makes absolutely no distinction for a patented drug. It doesn't say if it's on shortage, but there's a patent, it has nothing to say with regard to that. And if Congress intended to prohibit the compounding of drugs that are covered by a patent, but in shortage, then the FDA guidance would have stated that somewhere. So such a prohibition on compounding drugs on patent would not be in accordance with the purpose of permitting compounding of drugs in short supply. And the purpose is really the goal of this all is to ensure patients can continue to access needed and often essential medications despite supply chain issues or disruptions. The claims for patent infringement, they could only prevail where the 503A is compounding a drug that is essentially a copy, right, of a commercially available drug when the drug is off the shortage list. So those are the two scenarios. It would have to be off the shortage list, and they'd have to be compounding essentially a copy. There's a moderate risk of a patent infringement lawsuit being filed in the future by one of the GLP manufacturers against a compounding pharmacy. And, they have sued, not the GLP space, but there has been other suits against compounding pharmacies. But like I say, the pharmacies, they've either settled or there's been default judgments. The FDA really has no jurisdiction over patent law. They have no power to immunize compounding pharmacies for liability for patent infringement. And so, this is not legal advice, but, keep in mind that the fact that FDA states that it's not going to take enforcement action against a pharmacy compounding drugs that are essentially copies of drugs that are insured, it does not mean that the compounder themselves are immune from suits by the patent owner. And again, especially if the drug is not on shortage. But still, we haven't seen such a lawsuit for the GLP-1 agonists. And none of the 30 or so lawsuits now that Novo Nordisk has filed against compounders pertain to patent infringement. All of those lawsuits pertain to the Lanham Act, trademark infringement, unfair competition. So that's the past, but we don't know, if it's going to happen. But you have to keep in mind, too, that these patent lawsuits, they cost between $2.3 and $4 million on average. They take up, 3 to 5 years to reach trial. 95 to 97% of them are settled. And if one claim in the brand manufacturer's patent is found to be invalid, then the entire patent is invalid. And so there's a possibility that the semaglutide or the tirzepatide patent could be invalidated by a court in such a case. And the stakes are way too high for a manufacturer to take such a great risk of having its patents invalidated. And, in some countries, foreign countries, they have legislation that's called a patent use exemption for compounding. And it would be something that, we might think about in this country because that legislation would provide, more protection for pharmacies that are compounding.
Thanks, Martha. All right, so next question. I'm a 503B pharmacy buying from 503A pharmacy buying from 503B. Do I need to maintain a copy of the certificate of analysis? Does that mean that the COA from the manufacturer of the API or COA from 503B. And if the COA is written in a different language, do I need to get it translated, or do I need a copy of the original? So just to be clear, it is the 503B's responsibility to ensure that the certificate of analysis, formulation, stability, and beyond use state are in compliance. And the pharmacy need not obtain these documents from 503B. However, as part of the vetting process, and it would be great to have these documents handy. And if you have a translated copy, I would ask that I would ask the 503B to produce the original copy so that you have these documents as a backup. Record keeping is key for all pharmacies, especially independent pharmacies, as well as the compounding 503A compounding pharmacies. Okay, so the next question. When a telehealth entity is collecting payment from a patient that includes the pharmacy fee and the physician fee, and then transmitting that amount to the licensees, what are the primary compliance and consideration? Arielle, can you help answer this question?
Yeah. So in part 2 of our series, I discussed these types of single pay models, where the prescriber and the pharmacy are integrated either just with each other, or with each other and a third party administrative or marketing company. And the most critical part of compliance in that type of single pay model is first the flow of money, and second, the flow of the drug. And so we talk in much more depth about it in that webinar, but from a payment perspective, the flow of money has to be evaluated in terms of corporate practice of medicine, fee splitting, and kickbacks. And on the kickback piece, it's noteworthy that excluding a federal payer is not the end all be all of the conclusion there, because many states have kickback prohibitions that are going to apply irrespective of the payment source. So stakeholders really need to be cognizant of those rules when they're evaluating payment methodology. In terms of the flow of the prescription, it's also important to understand who's actually dispensing the product. If a pharmacy is dispensing compared to IOD or compared to a physician administration of the product, it can become a question of how it's being delivered to the patient, and whether it's being communicated to the patient that it's been fulfilled by a pharmacy. In some states, a physician, and we've seen a lot of models like this, where the physician is permitted to act as the patient's agent to receive the product from the pharmacy and then complete sort of that handoff to the patient. But there are definitely states where it's explicitly prohibited for a physician to act as agent of the patient for that purpose. With respect to kind of that disclosure of making sure that the patient's aware, it's relevant that they know who's dispensing the drug and that it not be miscommunicated or concealed that the pharmacy is involved, because there could be board of pharmacy concerns there, including unlicensed practice of pharmacy issues that would roll up to and create liability for the physician and for the pharmacy.
Thank you. All right, next question. Recently, we've identified many companies marketing themselves as pharmacy platforms who are sourcing prescription and then brokering those to network pharmacies. Is this permitted? And what do pharmacies need to keep in mind when they're approached by stakeholders of these models? Arielle?
Yeah, so that's very similar to the model that I just described, where there's a single pay system and the patient maybe isn't quite aware of who's treating them from the physician or the pharmacy perspective. Really, they're shown more the brand of whatever is being presented to them on the website. And so there's definitely a number of issues in that dynamic, but I'd say the issue at the forefront is going to be the payment mechanism and whether that broker who's originating the orders and originating the interest is really just orchestrating a model where they're being paid for referrals, which can lead to both kickback and fee splitting issues. There are a number of ways for administrative entities and marketing groups to get involved in these types of models, but the structure needs to be carefully considered to mitigate the risks that are associated with participation for all the parties involved.
All right, thank you. I think this, and then, okay, there's a last question. All right, are pre-printed prescription an issue, even if the product is on the shortage list? Well, pre-printed prescription could be an issue, regardless, and is an issue, regardless whether the product is on a shorter list or not. And certain states do not allow pre-printed prescription. And I believe there are a number of one or two states where they prohibit pre-printed prescription to be posted on the website. And we've handled pharmacy matters where a specific board of pharmacy took an issue with a pharmacy's website where they uploaded pre-printed prescription to be utilized by prescribers or other marketing representative. So I think again we need to look into the details of what is on that pre-printed prescription, but also the state law governing the pre-printed prescription usage. I think that is the end of the questions that we received from our previous webinars.
And I see that there's a couple questions in the chat here. So while we're not going to be able to get to those today, we'll certainly follow up with those of you who have submitted questions. And we thank you for joining us for Mastering GLP-1 Compounding Series, our question and answer roundup. We hope that we've provided you some valuable insights and answers to the questions you've presented throughout the series. Big thank you to Martha and Dae and to all of you for your participation. As we mentioned earlier, there will be a recording of this webinar and you will receive a link for it shortly. Feel free to reach out to us directly if you have any further questions or you didn't submit them in the Q&A. And our contact information is back up on the screen so that you have that to reach out. And on behalf of the Frier Levitt team, thanks for being part of this session and have a great day. We look forward to connecting with you in the future.